welcome to Freethinking 101, a program brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. This will be a program unlike any that you have seen before. We will challenge your thinking, your beliefs, and help you to clean out the cobwebs in the recesses of your mind. Tonight, for his second session, we have with us Steve Michalak, who is an active scientist, has an MS in chemistry, and is active in astronomy. He is a member of Gateway Skeptics of St. Louis, which qualifies him to look at the claims of astrology. In our first program, we looked at possible scientific explanations to account for the effects of astrology and saw that astrology cannot work within the bounds of traditional science as we know it. Before we get started, though, there was one thing I forgot to ask about in our last session. The astrologers, they base a lot of their ideas on the planets, and many of the ideas come from remote times. During those remote times, they didn't know about the planets Neptune and Pluto, and so I'm wondering how that has affected the astrology of today. If you can help with that.
That's a very interesting point for many reasons. When astrology was developed, the furthest planet they knew of was Saturn. Uranus, as well as Neptune and Pluto, were not there, were not included in determining someone's personality or some sort of characteristic about their success or lifestyle. When the astronomers finally found Uranus, it didn't take very long for the astrologers to all of a sudden start attributing characteristics to Uranus, and we now consider that planet when you put the personality together. I have to assume that prior to discovering that planet, people just had certain aspects of their personality they didn't know about. Likewise, when Neptune came around, they attributed new traits to that planet as well. And then there was a lot of questions asking of the astrologers, well, is there any more planets? And they took a look, and we pretty well covered all the personality types and character traits that are out there. There shouldn't be any more planets because we have a good grasp on people's personalities as it is. But then they discovered Pluto, and that threw them. Then they rethought, and they said, we've now thought of something, and according to the way we look at people, the way astrology works, there must be another planet, and this planet would probably be opposite of Earth in orbit, so that it's in the same orbital plane as Earth, same distance out from the sun, but always blocked from the sun that we wouldn't see it. And I guess they assumed they were safe that we'd never find it. That planet was named Vulcan. And they started attributing characteristics to that, depending on the position of this planet. And eventually, when we developed space technology and were able to fly above the sun or actually send radar beams around the sun, we were able to detect that there was no such planet, and all those characteristics just went by the wayside. So they have not been able to predict the existence of additional planets based on personality traits or vice versa.
They had to vulcanize their ideas.
Yes.
Or de-vulcanize them.
There's another aspect, let me mention as well, about comparing old astrology with new science. When astrology was developed, they didn't realize in those days that in certain places on the Earth, there is no sunrise or sunset, which is critical to having a horoscope. There are 12 million people on planet Earth that live either above the Arctic Circle or below the Antarctic Circle. These people on many days of the years cannot possibly have a horoscope because horoscope depends on the time the sun rises. And without that fact, I guess these people don't have personalities. I don't know how to explain that, but that's another inconsistency that astrologers just seem to step around.
Well, most of astrology is practiced in the non-Arctic zones anyway, I suspect. Is it possible that we just have not yet discovered or learned the mechanism by which astrology operates?
Yes, it's always possible that there's another force out there or something that's going on that would explain it, but this would be a catastrophe to science. I mean, everything that Newton and Einstein have put down would go out the window. Because it is not explainable by any of the forces, as we discussed in the previous program, and there is no science at all to support any of the claims that astrologers make.
Okay. What kind of studies have been done? Have the astrologers done any studies to support their views?
There have been numerous studies. I have been very surprised when I hit the library and started looking for what type of work has been out there. There's literally thousands of studies to see what kind of effects astrology has on personality and to see if personality relates. Many of the studies are done by astrologers, and conclusions are drawn which are way outside the bounds of science. Many errors are made in conducting the experiment. A lot of biases are placed, and you have to be careful how you conduct experiments. But if you look at the serious scientific studies where they put in appropriate controls and use appropriate techniques and methods for evaluating the effects, none of the claims that the astrologers put forth have been able to be proven out. I want to go through a few of these right now.
Very good.
One of the most interesting studies began in 1949 by Dr. Perot, who in a psychology class announced to his students that he has developed an astrological technique where he can predict their personalities based on just their birth dates alone. So he asked all the students to send him their birth dates and their location of their birth. And then he sent them out his own horoscope. It was actually the same horoscope from everyone. What he did is he went to a astrologer's handbook, something similar to this one, and he just opened up at random pages and took lines out of many different sections from different sun signs and different personality traits and wrote about 24 statements on a piece of paper. Gave everybody the same 24 statements. Then asked the students, how well does this pattern fit your personality?
Did he tell them not to compare theirs with others?
Yes, it was all done quietly, as best was controlled in this environment. But it still came back that 77% of the people agreed that this was them. It was amazing how all these people disagreed with the statements. It couldn't possibly be true, but 77% thought that he had predicted their personality very accurately.
Maybe 77% of them were born at the same time and place.
That's always likely, but I'm sure they checked it out. But anyway, they went through further studies to check this again. It could have been a fluke as well. One of the more interesting studies was conducted by a French scientist and statistician known as Dr. Gauquelin. He took an ad out in a paper, in a local newspaper, and advertised that he has an astrological technique for predicting personality, and that he would give everyone a horoscope if they would just return to him their birth dates and place of birth and agree to critique his findings or how accurate his predictions were. So he got hundreds and hundreds of requests. People sent in their birth dates and times and location, and he sent out again all the same horoscope, but he put a twist to it, a very ironic twist. He took the horoscope, the actual professionally done horoscope of one of the most notorious French murderers in history. Dr. Perot was the gentleman whose life was patterned after. Perot was someone who promised during the Nazi occupation for $10,000 to smuggle people out of the country. And when the people showed up at this house with the money, he'd take the money, murder the people, dissolve their bodies in sulfuric acid, and bury the bones. And he, I understand, killed dozens and dozens before he was finally caught. So one of the most notorious people. They sent his horoscope to all the hundreds of applicants. When the replies came back with the critiques showed that 95% of the people who were receiving the horoscopes thought that this horoscope of Dr. Perot fit them exactly. They were just amazed. And 90% of their relatives and friends agreed that this horoscope was them. It was very amazing.
Quite a collection of assassins there.
Could be, could be.
Well,
let's see. To further get involved in some of the studies, there are more studies that are done much more specifically and much more scientific than asking people whether they agree or not.
Yeah.
Some more objective studies. And what I have here is one of the many, many typical types of studies done. If we look on this chart,
We can look at a study that was done in Europe back in the 1930s where they sampled almost 3,000 musicians to see what birth dates they had. Astrologers believe that on certain days, at certain times, musicians are more likely to be born than on others. Or that, reversely, that certain positions of planets will affect or influence people become musicians instead of carpenters or instead of ditch diggers. So it's very objective nature to just examine the number of musicians and see if they're born at one time more than others. And you don't have to worry about whether someone recognizes himself or not or whatever bias is involved there.
Right.
So when he plotted out over the course of a year through, in this case, lining out each of the zodiacal constellations, charting the number, the magnitude of musicians born at that time, you can see for the most part in the chart there's kind of an average, no one really above or beyond, with the exception of right here in Taurus. There seems to be a very large peak, which is rather supportive to the astrologers, because Beethoven, again, was born in Taurus.
Gemini and Cancer are also above the, somewhat above,
The astrologers believe that those born in Taurus are more likely to become musicians, and this seems to bear that fact out. And this is as far as you carried the study, you would kind of conclude that you've proved astrology to be correct. But this is not as simple as it looks. There's some other mitigating factors involved. When you take a look at, for example, carpenters born in Europe at the same time, you see the exact same pattern, a peak in Taurus. Well, it might be that carpenters, again, are influenced by Taurus, but ditch diggers, scientists, everybody has a peak in Taurus. And that's because Taurus is a spring sign, and more births occur in spring in Europe than in any other time. So it's nothing unusual. This is an example of actually using a control to examine if there's anything unusual. Once you look at a control sample, people who are not musicians, you find out the same order of birth rate is there, so there's nothing significant about musicians above any other profession. Addition, you have to look a little bit at just the average error that's found in statistics. There's going to be a fluctuation up and down to some degree, some noise like this. It's analogous to someone taking 10 coins and flipping in the air. Usually you're going to have 5 coins heads and 5 coins tails. But not always. Sometimes it'll be 6 of one, 4 of the other, maybe 7 and 3, and even occasionally all 10 will come up either heads or tails. It doesn't mean that a miracle happened that time, it's just statistically will occur. So if you eliminate that error range, all these types of studies begin to disappear pretty quickly. Now, this is just one study done on musicians. I brought it for example, but this has been done on many other professions to see if something shows up. Let me show you some of these.
Dr. Lane also did sports figures too, I think, and I think if I recall correctly, he found that a lot of them had sort of condensed on Mars, the sign of Mars or something of that sort.
Yes, there are a lot of irregularities that are identified to where at certain times or certain times of years or planets being located in certain houses or in certain signs that may be more prevalent for a certain profession to be. And these things get to be the biggest puzzles of all, trying to recognize how they are. One of the more interesting examples of resolving this issue is that they found that more military people are born in September than other times of the year. And again, this was proof positive that astrology must work. Why else would there be more military people born at this time of the year? And when they look at the control population, they found out that no, there weren't more carpenters, or weren't a similar amount of carpenters or musicians or anything else. It was just military people this time of year.
Was that the sign of Mars?
It did involve Mars. It was more than just simply at the time of the year, but it also involved Mars. But the major point was September. And when you start to consider the controlling factors, one is that most military people come from military families. Their fathers are also in the military.
And they're on leave in December.
Exactly. They're on leave at Christmas 9 months earlier, and this is where most of the military children come from. So if you look at children born to military parents as the control sample, again, all the fluctuations disappear and there is no evidence that something occurs. If you look at this chart, these are just the number of raw studies that I've been able to dig up in the literature.
Yeah.
Looking for the sun sign alone, whether being born in Aries influences you in a certain occupation or another occupation. Over 60 different studies have been done. We looked at just the musicians as one, 59 others, which showed no tendency one way or the other. 42 medical phenomena, such as whether you're going to develop diabetes or have heart disease or whatever, none of these tended to be related to being born in one sun sign or another. 35 physical characteristics, such as you have a long nose, floppy ears, different color hair. Again, none of these showed up. Personality traits, 26 different personality traits, and this is what most people associate with astrology.
Yeah.
But the astrologers don't limit it to this at all. In personality traits, we're talking about how masculine you might be, or how generous, or how shy, things of this nature. 26 different personality traits which have been studied. Again, nothing has shown up. They looked at some nearly 3,000 marriages to see if certain, let's say, Cancer women would be compatible with Aries men,
Yeah.
or some particular sign combination, and could not find that more of one sign would marry more of another sign to any degree at all.
Yeah.
The astrologers come back and say, well,
Was this the sample number or number of studies?
in this case, this is the sample number in one study.
Okay.
All right.
I see.
The astrologers would come back and say, well, most people marry without knowing who they're supposed to be married to. And they're saying that, you know, if, let's say, a Cancer female marries a Aries male, they would not get along, so they'd end up in divorce.
Yeah.
So we turned out.
Do you think many people consult their horoscope and their potential mate's horoscope before they get married?
Definitely. I know many who do.
Oh.
Absolutely. I know people
That's
who
interesting.
refuse to go out with other people based on their sign.
Oh.
But when they came back and looked at divorce, they found that there was still no pattern, that you didn't even divorce finding someone incompatible.
Yeah.
All right. We looked at drug addictions in 1,300 plus people and found no pattern. Looked at whether people developed criminal behavior. Looked at some of the criminals on death row to see if they were due to being born under a particular sign or not. Again, nothing showed up. I looked at the number of people placed in Who's Who to see if that shows any pattern. No signs.
Successful people.
And the one I liked is to look for the birth of twins, because they all suspect if you're born in a Gemini, you're more prevalent to be born a twin. And again, nothing showed up. But this was looking at one sun sign, and the astrologers come back and say, well, it's not that simple. You have other mitigating factors, such as where certain planets are. So if you then consider where Mars would be at the time you were born in Virgo, you now complicate the picture. And you have to examine not only the 12 different possibilities of where your sun sign might be, but the 12 possibilities of where the planet might be. So this makes 144 different possibilities.
Right.
To get an appropriate statistical sample to check this out, you need something like 1,440 different subjects. So the population you need to test the theory becomes very large. Now, if you want to consider all the planets involved, some 10, including the sun and the moon alone, you've already built the population up to do the study to be well beyond the number of people alive on the Earth. So you can see it couldn't possibly have astrology have been built based on statistical sampling, that Aries people were this way and Cancer people were that way. Couldn't possibly have done that kind of a study because there wasn't enough people around when astrology was developed. There's still not that many people today. But the way astrology was developed was basically just through association. They would look at the sign in the sky, which is just what we recognize today to just be a random pattern of stars. They thought it was there for a purpose, that the pattern of stars that maybe formed the ram of Aries was purposely set there by gods or something that lived on planets. And if it happened to look like the ram or a goat, there must be some connection here. And they would associate that goats tend to, or the ram tends to climb on rocks or whatever and very steadily climbs, and that anyone associated with the sign would have an aspiring nature or a climbing nature. He would be good for management. And he could climb the corporate ladder. And they do this type of association. Someone born on a Taurus could be very stubborn, and just very simple associations to all the signs.
Begins to sound like magical thinking.
It does. Mars, for example, being very red, they associate with blood and warfare and being aggressive. And Mercury, which was a very fast-moving planet, being the closest to the sun, they associate with quick thinking, you know, and agility. Mercury, the god of swiftness. So associations just appeared to the planets. Jupiter, which was the brightest planet, was associated with happiness. And they assumed that these planets were not that way because they randomly were formed that way, but some force must have caused them to be the color and the brightness that they were.
Yeah.
And
I wonder if some of the latest findings of the Vanguard and the different flybys of the planets might change some of this. I don't know.
Yeah, it is curious that of all the work that the Voyagers have shown, they have not shown these gods yet to be on the planets.
Yeah.
And they must be there for astrology to be true.
Yeah.
Or what would be controlling all this. But if we looked at, if we go back to this chart and again look at other studies that have been done, to where they've done a large enough study to examine one planet with its relationship to the sun sign to see if now, considering a planet, and they usually would take the most influencing planet. For musicians, I believe it's Venus. For those involved in the military, it would be Mars. And examining the planet with the sun sign to see if there's a particular pattern. Again, with all these studies, nothing shows up.
Yeah.
There have been some planets or some studies which are real involved and used enormous population samples for control, in which, in this last one here, they examined 10 medical phenomena looking at 5 separate aspects, or 5 planets or 4 planets, and whether something is trine or square or conjunction, and looking at 5 different items, which makes it a very complicated and very extensive study, still could not resolve.
They probably couldn't have done that before the computer was developed.
No, obviously not.
Why would people believe a horoscope if it wasn't true?
Well, there are a couple of reasons why this might be the case, and psychologists have studied these effects to some degree. One of them is the Barnum effect. And most people are familiar with P.T. Barnum and its connection with the circus. Of course, most of them come to mind the idea of there's a sucker born every minute. That's not what I'm bringing up here.
Yeah.
That's probably very relevant. But P.T. Barnum used to say, to have a successful circus, you have to have something for everybody. So there's a large variety in the circus so that everybody who showed up would find something attractive. And that's how astrologers write the horoscope. They use a large variety of statements, and being very vague at that, so that whenever they make a comment about somebody's personality, they say something that will agree with you. You could say, well, you're generous, you have an above-average sense of humor, very general things that you'll find something in that reflects you. And this is very interesting. For example, they've done raw studies where they've asked people whether or not they have an above-average sense of humor. 82% of the population thinks they have above-average sense of humor. So if you say you have an above-average sense of humor, you're going to be right most of the time. Whether it can't possibly be true, but it turns out to be right. If you think you're attractive, it's something like 67% think they're above average in attractiveness, and if you're above average intelligence, 94% think that they're above average intelligence, and it goes on and on. So you can just deal in the areas where people are going to agree with you, and you'll be fine. Very few astrologers actually go out and say you're a greedy snob, because most people won't agree with that, so they leave that alone. So they biased the results in their favor. There's another effect, too, that many people are familiar with, called the Pygmalion effect. And this one is sort of an after-the-fact type effect, to where if the astrologers say that people who are Cancers have a tendency to be homebodies, that the people who are Cancers read that and kind of assume that to be true and kind of adopt that lifestyle. And it might not seem like much of an effect, but it's very true. And this has been studied out in many senses. If you imagine if someone was told that they have a tendency to be introverted, this person comes into a situation where he has a choice, let's say at a party, to be introverted or extrovert, and he feels uncomfortable. thinking that he's introverted, he might choose to be introverted. In a case where a child in a school, a teacher is taught that this child is above average intelligence, the teacher approaches him as he has above average intelligence and begins to treat him like he's a genius, and the child comes along and develops a much greater intelligence just on that treatment.
I think we're not going to have enough time to answer all the questions I have here, but this one I think is an interesting one. Even if astrology is not what it claims to be, could it not just be regarded as harmless entertainment?
Okay.
I think what you were just saying reflects on that some.
This is an important point. Let me make 2 points here. One, I don't necessarily believe that astrologers are out there to cause damage, to take advantage of people. I think they truly believe that what they're doing is correct and useful. Of course, if they tell you, hey, you have by my books here, above average sense of humor, and you say, yeah, that's me. They're getting reinforcement back from the public that they're correct. So it's not their fault. They truly believe that this is the case as well. But to consider whether this is harmless, I think needs a little bit of deeper thought. I consider it a form of prejudice or discrimination. I would not like to be on a job interview and someone say, I'm sorry, I don't think we can give you this job. We're looking for someone with managerial skills. You weren't even born under an appropriate sign, so you were going to be overlooked. I know people who refuse to date people because they're not the appropriate or compatible sign. I think that's very sad. People have to take responsibility for their actions and not use an excuse or blame some other object.
I'm going to have to discriminate against you right now because we're running out of time. I would like to thank you very much for being here, and perhaps we might be able to work out another one. There seems to be more to this than meets the eye. For those of you in our watching audience, we would like to suggest that if you would like to get in touch with us about this program or about other programs you might like to see on Freethinking 101, you can reach us by writing to our box number 2931, and that's zip code 63130, the Rationalist Society. Or if you would like to telephone us, we are in the 314 area code, and our phone number is 298-6649. We would like to hear from you and respond to any questions you might have. Again, Steve, thank you very much for enlightening us tonight.
It was a pleasure.